Welcome to Chronicle Stories TV. Before we begin, please drop a like and subscribe. Thank you. The story of Pedro Alonso López does not begin with horror. It begins with hardship. In the warm and rugged valleys of Tolima, Colombia, in 1948, a boy was born into a world already marked by pain. His mother, Benilda, raised 14 children alone in a cramped home where meals were scarce and silence was rare. She did what she could, surviving by selling goods, and sometimes herself, in the streets of a country torn by civil unrest. Pedro was her seventh child. Quiet, observant, and strange even as a toddler. His eyes followed everything. He rarely played with other children. Instead, he listened. He watched. And he waited. Home was not safe. The family lived shoulder to shoulder, with tempers always ready to ignite. Pedro's mother was a strict and volatile figure, her voice sharp, her discipline swift. The children knew better than to speak out of turn. Pedro, perhaps more than the others, kept to himself, learning early that silence could be a form of survival. At the age of 8, his life shifted permanently. An incident occurred in the home, one Pedro never fully explained, and which his mother did not forgive. She cast him out, accusing him of unacceptable behavior toward a sibling. With little more than the clothes on his back, Pedro stepped out into the streets, alone. That night, under a rusted overhang behind a fruit stall, Pedro curled up and tried to sleep. Around him, the night pulsed with city noise, dogs barking, bottles breaking, tires screeching. He was no longer a boy in a home. He was a child in a world that didn't care whether he survived the night. No one came looking for him. No one asked where he'd gone. The streets of Colombia in the 1950s were chaotic. Children wandered barefoot between cars, knocking on windows for coins, stealing bread, sleeping on rooftops and in drainage ditches. Pedro became one of them. He quickly learned the rules of street life: never trust kindness, never sleep in the same place twice, and always keep your eyes open. A man once offered him a meal and a place to stay. Hungry and exhausted, Pedro accepted. But behind the promise was betrayal, an act of manipulation and cruelty that left Pedro emotionally scarred. He left in silence, but not without remembering the face. He would remember it for decades. By his teens, Pedro drifted from town to town. He became good at disappearing. He could blend in, vanish into crowds, become invisible. He traveled with other street boys, sometimes working small jobs, sometimes stealing. He spoke little but listened to everything. Over time, his heart seemed to harden. At 18, he was caught stealing a car and sentenced to prison. But prison in Colombia at the time wasn't just a place to serve time. It was a place that stripped men down. Inside, Pedro stayed quiet and kept to himself. He watched from the shadows. And eventually, he adapted. What happened behind those prison walls was never fully confirmed. But when Pedro left prison, years later, he was no longer a desperate boy looking for food or shelter. He was a man with a quiet, focused intensity, someone who had learned how to survive in the most dangerous places. He began to travel again, but this time with a purpose. A cold, disturbing purpose he kept buried behind a soft voice and polite smile. The Andes stretched before him, wide and open and full of remote places where no one asked questions. And soon, girls began to disappear. The late 1970s brought subtle fear to the remote villages tucked in the folds of the Andes. In Colombia, Ecuador, and later Peru, families began to notice something troubling: young girls were vanishing. These weren't isolated incidents, and they weren't coincidences. The children, usually between the ages of 8 and 12, disappeared without a sound, without a trace. At first, the disappearances were written off. Local police blamed poverty, migration, or trafficking. After all, these were poor, rural areas where record-keeping was loose and resources were stretched thin. But for the families, the silence that followed their daughters' disappearances was not just bureaucratic, it was deafening. Posters faded in the sun. Names were whispered in grief. And the girls were never seen again. Pedro Alonso López had perfected his mask by then. He dressed plainly. He spoke gently. He always approached with kindness, often in broad daylight. Sometimes he offered sweets. Other times, small trinkets. He didn't need to use force. He knew how to wait. How to smile. How to vanish with his victim before anyone noticed. He chose his targets with a chilling sense of calculation, girls walking home alone from markets, schools, or fetching water. He never stayed in one village too long. He would pass through, wait, observe, and strike. Then he moved on, like a shadow drifting from one valley to the next. He later told authorities that the rural markets were his hunting grounds. "I looked for innocence," he said in an interview. His tone was flat, his eyes expressionless. He spoke not with pride, but with certainty, as though he believed his actions made sense in some twisted logic only he understood. But at the time, no one knew who was behind the disappearances. There was no name. No face. Just loss. In Ambato, Ecuador, the panic became more than whispers. By 1979, the number of missing girls could no longer be ignored. Concerned parents began forming search parties. Some even patrolled the streets with makeshift weapons, hoping to find the person responsible. But there were no sightings, no reports, no suspects. Whoever was doing this left no trace behind. The local authorities struggled to respond. Most of the missing were from impoverished families. The communities had little influence, and media coverage was minimal. But then, something changed. During a flash flood in a rural area just outside Ambato, a horrifying discovery was made. The bodies of several young girls were uncovered by the rising waters. They had been buried in shallow graves, carefully spaced. Officials were stunned. The case could no longer be ignored. At the same time, a foreign missionary working in the area began to notice a man frequenting the town's markets, watching children a little too closely. The man was polite. Quiet. He spoke Spanish fluently but with a strange tone, almost rehearsed. Something about him felt off. One day, the missionary saw the man attempting to lure a girl away from a busy plaza. She intervened immediately and reported the incident to the police. That man was Pedro Alonso López. It was the first real break authorities had. When police arrested him, they expected a vagrant, maybe a petty thief. What they uncovered during questioning would shake the region to its core. At first, Pedro Alonso López was quiet. In the small, dim room where he was questioned, he sat with his hands calmly folded, his eyes drifting from one officer to the next. He didn't look dangerous. He didn't even look angry. He looked tired. Polite. Almost helpful. The detectives asked simple questions. Where was he from? Why was he in Ambato? What was his name? He answered smoothly. Pedro, he said. Just passing through. But they had already received reports about him from the missionary. And more importantly, they knew about the recent attempt to lure a child. It gave them reason to hold him longer. Hours passed. Then, something strange happened. Without warning, Pedro leaned forward. "I can tell you where they are," he said softly. The officers paused. "Who?" they asked. He looked directly at them. The girls. At first, they thought he was lying. Or unstable. But Pedro was calm. Too calm. He began to speak, slowly, deliberately. He told them he had taken many girls. Not just in Ecuador, but in Colombia and Peru. He didn't give details at first. He simply said there were many, and that he had buried them. The officers didn't believe him. not fully. But Pedro was persistent. He asked for a map. When they brought him one, he began pointing. "Here," he said. "There's one. And another here." The police went to the first location. It was outside of town, just beyond a patch of eucalyptus trees. The earth was disturbed. When they dug, what they found turned their doubt into horror. He wasn't lying. Over the next few days, Pedro continued to talk. There was no shouting, no rage, no tears. Just quiet descriptions of places, villages, and valleys where he said he had buried children. He spoke like someone describing furniture in a house, matter of fact, emotionless. The detectives, disturbed but desperate for answers, documented everything. They returned to the burial sites Pedro described. Again and again, they found remains. He claimed to have killed over 100 girls in Ecuador alone, and over 300 in total, across 3 countries. The numbers were almost impossible to believe. Authorities didn't want to accept it. How could this have gone unnoticed? How could one man have moved between countries, across mountains and rivers, committing so many crimes without being caught? The answer was terrifying in its simplicity. No one had been looking. In the rural Andean regions, there were few resources. Missing children reports often went unfiled. Police stations were understaffed. Families were told their children had run away. And Pedro had used that to his advantage. He kept moving. He changed towns constantly. He picked his victims carefully, always in places where his face would be forgotten within days. He was a ghost. One officer later said, "It was like interviewing a fog." He never raised his voice. He never smiled. But the things he said chilled us more than any scream. Pedro described what he did with an eerie clarity. But he avoided specifics about what happened to the victims. He simply said they were taken. That word alone was enough. The press began to catch on. Headlines appeared. "Monster of the Andes," they called him. The world finally knew his name. News of Pedro Alonso López's arrest began to spread beyond Ambato, beyond Ecuador, beyond even South America. At first, the story seemed too disturbing to be true. How could one man be responsible for the disappearances of hundreds of girls? How had he crossed borders, hunted so quietly, and evaded capture for years? As journalists began to dig deeper, they uncovered a string of missing persons cases stretching back almost a decade across Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, all with disturbingly similar patterns. Young girls. Remote villages. No witnesses. No suspects. No leads. The public was horrified. But there was also confusion. How could no one have noticed? Why hadn't anyone connected the cases sooner? Police forces from all 3 countries began working together for the first time. They compared notes, dug into old files, re-interviewed families, and followed López's travel history. The deeper they looked, the more they uncovered. In many of the places Pedro had visited, families remembered a soft-spoken man who had passed through town. Always friendly. Always quiet. And then, shortly after, a girl would vanish. In court, Pedro often remained still. He listened politely. He answered questions with clarity and calmness. He didn't argue. He didn't cry. He didn't show anger. To many who saw him, that was the most disturbing part. He was ordinary. And that made it worse. As the investigation continued, Pedro López remained eerily cooperative. In fact, he volunteered information that even the police hadn't discovered yet. In long sessions with detectives, he described the terrain around burial sites, landmarks near rivers, and the specific times of day he would approach small towns. He remembered details most wouldn't. When asked why he did what he did, his answers were vague, disconnected. "They were innocent," he said once. "I wanted to take their innocence before the world could." It was a chilling statement, one that haunted investigators and prosecutors alike. But López didn't seem to think he was evil. He believed he was cleansing something. His logic was twisted, but he held onto it firmly. Some psychologists who examined him during pre-trial assessments said he displayed traits of severe antisocial personality disorder, combined with narcissistic behavior and delusional thinking. Yet, they also noted that he was strangely articulate, intelligent, and emotionally flat. It was like speaking to someone who didn't understand human emotion, one psychiatrist said. Not because he was incapable of feeling, but because he never saw a reason to. Despite his cooperation, many of the families were still left without answers. Not all the remains could be found. In some cases, Pedro's memory was vague. In others, natural forces had erased the evidence. Still, the court had enough testimony, and enough forensic proof, to move forward. Pedro Alonso López, now called the Monster of the Andes by media around the world, was finally going to face justice. But what came next would leave many stunned and outraged. In 1980, Pedro Alonso López stood before a judge in Ecuador. Though he had confessed to more than 300 murders across South America, the court focused on the cases they could confirm within Ecuador, a total of 110 girls whose remains were found or whose disappearances were linked directly to him. The courtroom was tense. Families of the victims sat in silence, some gripping rosaries, others staring coldly at the men who had taken their daughters. López didn't flinch. He stood quietly, answered questions when asked, and looked ahead with that same detached expression he had worn since the day of his arrest. The prosecution presented maps, timelines, and testimony from investigators who had followed Pedro's confessions to real graves. Forensic teams matched bone fragments to missing children. In some cases, personal items were found: a doll, a shoe, a school uniform. Each item told a story. A short one. A final one. There were no angry outbursts from López. No remorse. No apologies. At times, it felt as though he wasn't fully present, as if he were watching someone else's trial. The court eventually found him guilty of 110 counts of murder in Ecuador alone. He was sentenced to just 16 years in prison, the maximum sentence allowed under Ecuadorian law at the time, even for serial murder. The room fell into stunned silence. Families wept, some cried out in disbelief. Others left the courtroom in shock. How could someone who confessed to killing hundreds of children walk free in just over a decade? But the law, as written, was clear. And so, Pedro was imprisoned. But not for life. Inside Garcia Moreno prison, one of Ecuador's most infamous detention centers, Pedro Alonso López served his time. Compared to his earlier prison experiences, this was different. He wasn't just another inmate. He was notorious now, a name known across the world. The Monster of the Andes. He read newspapers. He gave interviews. In one, he reportedly claimed, "I am the man of the century." The words echoed through headlines, making him seem even more detached from the weight of his crimes. He received letters. Some of them were from curious journalists, others from disturbed admirers. But Pedro never seemed interested in fame. He simply waited. Time passed slowly, but he showed no fear of the future. By 1994, after serving just 14 years, Pedro López was released early for good behavior. His time in prison had been quiet, orderly, controlled. He gave no trouble. He was calm. The world was stunned again. After his release, he was handed over to Colombian authorities. For a short time, it looked like he would be tried for murders committed in his home country. But instead, he was declared insane and committed to a psychiatric facility in Bogotá. That facility held him for just 4 more years. In 1998, Pedro Alonso López was released from the psychiatric hospital on the condition that he would check in regularly with Colombian authorities. He was given a small amount of financial support and allowed to disappear quietly. And then, he vanished. To this day, no one knows where he went. In 1998, after being released from psychiatric care, Pedro Alonso López walked out of the hospital and into the streets of Bogotá, Colombia. He did not return to his home village. He did not alert authorities beyond the required initial check-ins. And very quickly, he was gone. Some reports suggest he may have changed his name. Others say he might have fled the country entirely, perhaps back into Peru or even into the jungles of Brazil. A few even claimed he had died shortly after his release, but no body was ever recovered. To this day, his whereabouts remain unknown. Interpol issued a warrant. His name was added to international watch lists. Rumors occasionally surface, a man fitting his description spotted in a rural town, or a traveler with a strange accent who asks too many questions. But nothing has ever been confirmed. For law enforcement, it's one of the most haunting unresolved threads in criminal history. A man who confessed to murdering hundreds of children simply disappeared. One retired investigator put it plainly in an interview. "We had him. And then the system let him go. Now he's a ghost again. Just like before." Some believe he's still alive, living under a new identity. Others are convinced he continued his crimes elsewhere, in areas without the resources to catch him. And others believe he faded into obscurity, perhaps too old or too hunted to do harm again. But the not knowing is what truly unsettles people. The thought that he may be out there, still walking, still smiling, still watching. The story of Pedro Alonso López leaves behind more than unanswered questions. It leaves scars, deep, permanent scars in the communities he passed through. In towns across the Andes, there are still families who visit the graves of daughters who never made it home. Some graves are marked with names. Others hold only symbols, placed above bones recovered from the sites López described. In a few villages, murals have been painted, not of him, but of the children. Bright, colorful images of smiling girls frozen in time. The people never forgot. In interviews with families years later, many expressed frustration not only with the horror of what happened, but with the failure of systems that were meant to protect them. Local police who dismissed reports. Courts limited by outdated laws. Mental health institutions that underestimated the risk. He didn't just take lives, one father said in a quiet voice, he took trust. He made us afraid to let our children walk to school, afraid of kindness from strangers, afraid of silence. Psychologists and criminal profilers have studied López's case for decades. Some say he represents a rare and extreme category of predator, methodical, patient, and detached. Others argue he was shaped by his early trauma, by abuse and abandonment, molded by violence until he became violence himself. But even those with deep knowledge of criminal behavior agree, López was unlike anything they had ever seen. Not only for what he did, but for how calmly he told the world about it. After his arrest, several psychologists and criminal profilers spent hours interviewing Pedro Alonso López. They wanted to understand how a single person could commit such a high number of crimes, not in bursts of rage, but with chilling consistency and quiet intent. What they found was disturbing, not just because of what he said, but because of what H. laughed. His tone was always the same, soft, matter-of-fact, almost clinical. To him, what he did seemed justified in some warped inner logic. He didn't fit into the usual patterns, one Colombian psychiatrist noted. He wasn't impulsive. He wasn't messy. He was methodical. He believed he had a purpose. Pedro reportedly claimed that he had a mission, though what that mission was remained vague and troubling. He never described himself as evil. He did not think he was sick. When asked why he targeted children, he answered with a cold phrase, "They were pure. I wanted that before the world ruined it." Psychiatrists labeled him a psychopath with severe antisocial personality disorder. But even among others with similar diagnoses, Pedro stood out. There was no detectable anxiety in him. No fear of death. No fear of consequence. He did not brag, but neither did he regret. One profiler described him as a man whose heart had no pulse. And yet, he was never loud. Never violent in custody. He cooperated. He helped police find the graves. He gave interviews without hesitation. To many who sat across from him, that was what made him most terrifying. In the years following his release, Pedro Alonso López became a symbol, not just of evil, but of failure. A failure of justice. A failure of law. A failure of systems that should have stopped him much sooner. Ecuador's legal system, at the time of his conviction, had a maximum penalty of 16 years, regardless of how many lives were taken. Even with 110 confirmed victims, the law placed a ceiling on punishment. And because of good behavior, Pedro served only 14 years. When he was transferred to Colombia, many believed a longer sentence would follow. Surely, with his crimes crossing borders, there would be further charges. But instead, the court declared him mentally unfit to stand trial, not criminally responsible, but insane. That label sent him not to prison, but to a psychiatric hospital. There, doctors observed him for 4 years before releasing him, claiming he no longer posed a threat to society. They were wrong. Or perhaps they weren't. Perhaps he truly never acted again. But no one knows. Because no one kept track. In the decades since, reform efforts have taken place. Ecuador has increased maximum prison sentences. International databases for missing persons have improved. Collaboration between countries is stronger. But the fact remains, one of the most prolific serial killers in history was released, and lost. And for many, that is the most haunting part of the story. Decades after his disappearance, the name Pedro Alonso López still stirs fear in those who remember him. In the villages he once passed through, his story is spoken of like a ghost tale, not with superstition, but with caution. Parents still warn children not to speak with strangers. Some elders still remember the faces of the missing. To them, Pedro wasn't just a name in a newspaper. He was the reason they kept their doors locked during the day. In schools, teachers sometimes mention him when talking about safety. Not graphically, but as a lesson. A warning that evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it smiles. Sometimes it speaks gently. Sometimes it passes through and disappears before anyone realizes the damage done. There have been documentaries, books, even radio specials made about his crimes. Most focus on the scale, the sheer number of missing girls, the cross-border complexity of his path, and the legal system that couldn't contain him. But some go deeper, examining how the world allowed him to thrive in the first place. Corruption. Poverty. Indifference. Many believe that Pedro was not just a predator, but a result of the systems around him. A man shaped by early trauma, ignored by authorities, and overlooked by a world that didn't pay attention to missing children from poor towns. He was evil, one journalist said, but he was also a mirror, reflecting how little value society placed on the lives of the forgotten. Interpol still lists Pedro Alonso López among the world's most wanted fugitives. But that file grows older every year. Leads dry up. Witnesses age. Memories fade. The last confirmed sighting of him was in 1998, shortly after his release from the psychiatric facility in Colombia. Some reports claimed he moved into the countryside under a different name. Others suggested he crossed into Venezuela, or fled further into South America under forged documents. None of those leads were confirmed. Law enforcement has revisited the case many times, especially after child disappearances in rural areas that resembled his methods. In each instance, investigators searched for similarities, geographic patterns, age ranges, vanishing tactics. but no new evidence has tied him to any recent crimes, at least not officially. A few retired detectives still work the case in their spare time. One keeps a folder of old maps and newspaper clippings in his desk drawer. If he's still alive, the detective said in an interview, he's probably watching. He always watched. Always stayed 10 steps ahead. Some claim the silence means he's dead. Others believe that's what he wants the world to think. The case of Pedro Alonso López remains open in several countries. His name may be fading from headlines, but in dark corners of archives and memory, it still burns, cold, unresolved, and unnerving. In the years following Pedro Alonso López's disappearance, his case became required reading for criminologists and law enforcement agencies studying serial offenders. What made him so terrifying wasn't only the scale of his crimes, but how quietly and efficiently he moved across 3 countries without being caught for years. There were no calling cards, no taunting letters, no elaborate disguises. Just a man who traveled with nothing but the clothes on his back and an uncanny ability to disappear. His case reshaped how investigators viewed crimes in rural areas. It taught them that serial killers don't always operate in cities, and that when the victims come from poor, remote communities, their stories are more likely to be ignored. One international conference on criminal profiling even referred to López as the master of unnoticed horror. It wasn't a compliment, it was a warning. As technology improved in the decades that followed, so did tracking methods. DNA databases grew. Borders became tighter. Missing persons reports were taken more seriously, even in underfunded towns. The López case was often cited as the reason those changes were needed. Yet, for all the advancements, many believed the world had been too slow. The systems that were supposed to protect the most vulnerable had failed, and Pedro had slipped through the cracks like smoke in the wind. The psychological effects of López's crimes didn't end with the victims or their families. The fear he left behind carried through entire generations. In some villages where girls had vanished, population numbers actually declined in the following years. Parents moved away. Communities grew quieter. In the homes that remained, there were unspoken rules. Children weren't allowed to walk alone. Strangers were treated with suspicion. Locked doors became more common, even in the daylight. What once were trusting, open towns became guarded. School teachers began to include safety lessons in their daily routines. Posters went up on classroom walls, not with images of Pedro López, but with warnings about strangers, missing children hotlines, and what to do if someone tries to lure you away. These weren't panic responses. They were survival habits. Small but lasting changes in the way people lived. And in universities, his case became a haunting study in human behavior. Students debated what created a man like López. Was it nature or nurture? Did his childhood create the monster, or was the monster already there? Some believe he was a byproduct of abandonment, poverty, and unchecked trauma. Others insist he was born with something broken inside him. But regardless of how he came to be, the effect he had on those who crossed his path, or those who simply learned about him, was permanent. He left behind no memoirs. No confessions written in notebooks. Just words spoken softly in interviews, and stories carried through court documents, police reports, and the voices of grieving families. As news of Pedro Alonso López spread across Latin America and eventually the world, the media struggled to balance public interest with responsibility. Some outlets printed sensational headlines, dubbing him the monster of the Andes, while others took a quieter, more investigative approach. Photos of his calm face, emotionless, with tired eyes and a slight frown, were splashed across newspapers and televisions. He didn't look like the villain the public expected. And that contrast disturbed people even more. Television crews traveled to the villages he had haunted. Documentaries were produced. Interview clips were replayed. At one point, a recording of Pedro describing how he selected his victims surfaced, spoken not in a sinister tone, but with a detached calmness that sent chills down listeners' spines. The press coverage brought attention to rural crime, to the mishandling of missing persons cases, and to the broken legal systems that had enabled him. But it also raised difficult questions. Were they informing the public, or feeding a morbid curiosity? To strike balance, some broadcasters focused not on Pedro himself, but on the children, telling the stories of the victims, their families, and the communities forever changed by his actions. They interviewed mothers who still kept faded photographs in their wallets, and school teachers who remembered empty seats in their classrooms. Those stories were harder to tell. But they mattered. Because behind the numbers and headlines were real lives. Real names. And grief that had no end. In the years since López vanished, his story has continued to echo not just in law enforcement circles, but in books, classrooms, and quiet conversations across South America. Writers, filmmakers, and researchers have tried to understand him, not to glorify his crimes, but to dissect the anatomy of evil hidden in plain sight. Some authors called him the perfect predator, not because of brilliance, but because of invisibility. He didn't stand out. He didn't intimidate. And that made him lethal. In art and literature, references to him appear in metaphors: the monster who walks without sound, the shadow behind the smile. Folktales in some areas even began to absorb aspects of his story, merging fear with myth. Stories told to children at night to keep them cautious, to make sure they never wander too far from home. But outside of folklore, the real memory remains in legal reforms and safety campaigns. In Ecuador, laws were updated to allow longer sentences for violent crimes. In Colombia, psychological screenings for released inmates became more structured. Across borders, efforts to connect missing children reports became more urgent, databases were improved, communication between police stations tightened. And still, his name lingers, not as a celebrity, but as a warning. Pedro Alonso López was never found again. His face may have aged. His voice may have gone silent. But in many places, his presence is still felt. In quiet markets. On missing posters. And in the eyes of those who remember. Inside the archives of police departments in Ecuador, Colombia, and Peru, there are still thick, dust-covered case files with Pedro Alonso López's name on them. Folders full of black and white photographs, hand-drawn maps, and typed statements taken decades ago. Some are faded with time. Others remain untouched since the day they were closed. To investigators who worked the case, López was more than just a suspect, he was a puzzle. A man who admitted to unimaginable crimes, yet showed no pride, no remorse, no fear. Some officers called him the most cooperative killer they had ever met. Others said he was the most frustrating. He gave answers, but not closure. After his release, many of those who had helped uncover his crimes felt defeated. They had put their trust in the system. They had believed justice would hold him. But in the end, the law was too small for the scale of his evil. One retired officer in Ambato kept a photo of one of the first discovered burial sites on the wall of his home office. Not because he wanted to remember Pedro, but because he wanted to remember what was missed. It reminds me, he said, that we didn't see the signs. And it reminds me to keep looking for the ones we might be missing now. Younger officers study the López case in training now. It's treated not as a solved crime, but as a lesson. Evil doesn't always come with warning signs. Sometimes it arrives with a smile and a soft voice. To this day, no official sighting of Pedro Alonso López has ever been confirmed after 1998. No fingerprints. No DNA. No confirmed location. Some speculate he may have died in the wilderness, far from civilization. Others believe he may have assumed a new identity, blending into a quiet town, perhaps even starting over in a place where his past is unknown. The frightening truth is, both scenarios are possible. The idea that he simply vanished, after confessing to the murders of over 300 young girls, is what unsettles so many. Most killers leave traces. Pedro left whispers. He never wrote a book. He never sold his story. He never made further public statements after his release. If he is alive, he is silent. If he is dead, he took his secrets with him. There are still families who check the news once a year, hoping for some update. A clue. A mistake. A rediscovered fingerprint. But none comes. In a world where cameras are everywhere, and most people can be traced through digital trails, Pedro Alonso López remains one of the few who disappeared without a footprint. His absence feels like a final act of control, one last reminder that he moved in the dark, and left the world without saying goodbye. In the decades after López's disappearance, the digital age dawned, and with it, new tools to track fugitives and protect the vulnerable. DNA databases became global. International law enforcement networks linked their records. Missing persons hotlines and online registries emerged, giving families a platform that simply didn't exist in 1970s South America. Yet, even with these advances, Pedro Alonso López remained elusive. Investigators combed through genealogical databases, submitted his DNA profile for familial matches, and scanned immigration records for anomalies. Facial recognition software was run against decades of passport photos and surveillance stills. Every tip, no matter how small, was logged and followed. In one case, a woman in southern Argentina reported being approached by a man with a gentle smile and gold-rimmed glasses, details eerily reminiscent of López's appearance in the 1970s. Investigators traveled there, interviewed witnesses, and submitted photos for analysis. The match probability was low, but the fear it generated in the community was real. Despite intensive efforts, no confirmed sighting ever panned out. Some experts believe López could have died in obscurity, far from any record. Others argue that if he were still alive by the 2000s, he would likely have been caught by now, unless, as some fear, he learned to live entirely off the grid. One digital forensic specialist working cold cases said, "We're better equipped than ever to catch someone like López. But we still need eyes and ears on the ground." Technology is a tool, not a replacement for vigilance. In communities across the Andes, and beyond, efforts to protect children have taken on new forms. Civil society organizations, inspired in part by López's case, conduct regular safety workshops in rural schools. Local leaders organize walking buses, groups of children who travel to and from school together under adult supervision. Smartphone apps now allow any citizen to report a suspicious person or incident with a few taps, instantly alerting neighbors and authorities. One such app, developed by volunteers in Colombia, includes a map of historical disappearance sites. Users can see when and where children went missing, and share real-time updates about sightings or concerns. In many villages, parents maintain informal watch groups, rotating schedules to patrol paths and crossroads. Teachers incorporate digital safety lessons alongside old-fashioned warnings about stranger danger. Parents download family tracking apps that show their children's locations. And in urban areas, community centers host self-defense classes for teenagers. These measures aren't guarantees against harm, but they represent a shift in mindset. No longer do remote or impoverished regions feel powerless to respond. They've taken the lessons of the past and translated them into proactive protection. And yet, the shadow of Pedro Alonso López lingers in their cautionary tales. His crimes taught the world that evil can wear a gentle face, and that vigilance must be constant, wherever children walk alone. The case of Pedro Alonso López continues to influence global justice systems, not only because of its horrifying scope, but because of what it revealed about the weaknesses between borders. His ability to commit crimes across 3 countries, Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, exposed serious flaws in communication between law enforcement agencies at the time. Today, many South American countries have developed cooperative networks to monitor cross-border criminal activity, especially involving vulnerable groups like children. Shared databases, region-wide alerts, and rapid response teams are now more common, built on the lessons learned from the gaps that allowed López to operate for so long. Interpol still holds an active red notice for López. Though decades old, it is updated whenever new technology offers a possibility to scan records or test evidence again. His case is sometimes reviewed during international crime summits. Not because there's hope he'll be found, but because he symbolizes what can happen when systems fail to coordinate. "We weren't just chasing a man," said one retired Ecuadorian investigator. "We were chasing time, language, red tape, and we lost." Pedro's ability to vanish remains one of the most baffling failures of international justice. And yet, that very failure has inspired changes that may one day stop someone like him much earlier in their path. As years passed, Pedro Alonso López shifted from a known criminal into something larger, a myth, a warning, a story told in quiet voices long after dark. In classrooms, he is mentioned as part of criminology courses. In rural towns, he's whispered about like a ghost whose shadow once passed through. Some cultures have incorporated his story into folklore, intentionally blurring fact and legend to deliver a warning. In one Andean village, parents speak of El Hombre Gris, the gray man. A figure who watches from the hills and takes children who stray too far from home. While the name is different, the source is clear. This transformation from person to symbol is not new in human history. Many notorious figures become distorted by time. But in López's case, the myth serves a purpose. It keeps awareness alive. It preserves the need for caution. And it ensures that the loss of hundreds of lives is never completely forgotten. Still, for investigators and victims' families, myth is no comfort. They continue to hope for answers, even after all these years. Closure doesn't always come with a conviction. Sometimes, it comes with knowledge of what happened, why it happened, and what has been done to prevent it from happening again. Pedro Alonso López may be gone. But the echo of his crimes, carried in policy, memory, and myth, remains. Even now, so many questions about Pedro Alonso López remain unanswered. How did he avoid suspicion for so long? How many victims were there really? Was he ever truly stopped, or just delayed? And above all, where did he go? There are no confirmed fingerprints, no death certificate, no arrest, no burial. No family members have come forward to report him missing. No former associates have ever spoken out. If he died, it happened in silence. If he lived, it was in hiding. Criminal experts still debate how a man so infamous could simply disappear. Some believe he may have found shelter in areas with no formal identity systems. Others argue he must have received help, perhaps from people who never knew his full past. A few darker theories suggest he changed his methods, his target profile, and continued without drawing attention. But these are theories. Nothing more. What frustrates investigators most is the lack of resolution. Most high-profile criminal cases have a clear end, an arrest, a trial, a sentence, or a body. With Pedro Alonso López, there is only absence. That silence allows speculation to grow. And for the families of the missing, it allows a different kind of grief, one shaped not only by loss, but by uncertainty. Closure doesn't come easily when the story has no end. Despite the darkness of Pedro López's actions, something powerful has emerged in the years since, a culture of vigilance. Not of fear, but of awareness. Of accountability. Of listening to the voices that were once ignored. In the past, the disappearances of poor children in rural areas were often brushed aside. Today, they are taken more seriously. News spreads faster. Investigations begin sooner. And families are louder. Empowered by community, technology, and a growing belief that every life deserves attention. López's story has been taught in law schools, criminal psychology programs, and journalism courses. But the focus is shifting, not just on what he did, but on how systems responded. How people learned. How justice evolved in his wake. Some countries have passed laws named after victims. Others have increased sentencing power for serial crimes. Helplines have been expanded. Nonprofits have grown stronger. In a way, the world has slowly built defenses out of what was once tragedy. One human rights advocate put it best. We cannot undo what was done. But we can make sure that the silence he used no longer protects people like him. That's how we fight back. The story of Pedro Alonso López does not need embellishment. It stands on its own, a chilling reminder of what was lost, and a call to protect what remains. For the families who lost daughters to Pedro Alonso López, healing has been a slow and painful journey. Grief did not end with his capture or imprisonment. The years that followed were filled with questions, memories, and the difficult task of rebuilding lives forever changed. Some found solace in community gatherings, small ceremonies honoring the missing children, where stories were shared and candles were lit. Others dedicated their lives to activism, fighting for better protections for vulnerable children and support for victims' families. Mental health services in affected regions have improved, offering counseling for trauma survivors and families. Schools now include programs teaching children how to recognize danger and seek help. These steps cannot erase the past, but they are hopes for the future. In villages where once silence reigned, voices now rise, determined to remember and protect. Though Pedro Alonso López vanished into obscurity, the vigilance inspired by his crimes remains alive. Across South America and beyond, law enforcement agencies collaborate more closely, using new technologies and shared databases to track missing persons and potential offenders. Communities stay alert, aware that danger can sometimes hide behind the most ordinary faces. Parents teach their children to be cautious but not fearful, fostering strength alongside safety. The story of the monster of the Andes has become more than a chilling tale, it is a call to action. A reminder that the protection of the innocent requires constant effort, compassion, and watchfulness. Though the past holds many dark chapters, the future belongs to those who refuse to forget, and who refuse to let history repeat itself. The legacy of Pedro Alonso López reaches far beyond the immediate horror of his crimes. His case pushed governments, communities, and international organizations to rethink how they protect children, especially in rural and underserved areas. In many places across South America, governments introduced stricter laws related to child protection, improved coordination between police forces, and increased funding for social services. NGOs expanded their reach, educating families about safety, and providing resources for vulnerable children. Educational campaigns now emphasize early intervention, spotting signs of abuse, reporting suspicious behavior, and providing safe spaces for children to speak up. These lessons are a direct response to the gaps that allowed López to operate for so long. More importantly, his story reminds us all that protecting the most vulnerable is a collective responsibility. Governments, communities, and individuals must work together to create safer environments, where every child can grow without fear. Pedro Alonso López's story is difficult to hear, but it serves as a crucial reminder. His crimes were real, devastating, and tragic. Yet, the fear that such stories provoke does not have to lead to paralysis or despair. Communities have learned to remember without fear, to honor victims by strengthening protections rather than succumbing to hopelessness. His name is mentioned not to glorify but to educate and inspire change. In schools, in training centers, and in conversations across neighborhoods, his case is cited as a warning, but also as a turning point. A moment in history when silence ended, and vigilance began. The story of the monster of the Andes is a call to action for generations to come, to stay aware, to speak out, and to protect those who cannot protect themselves. In the years since Pedro Alonso López's crimes came to light, many communities affected by his actions have come together to heal and protect one another. Local leaders, parents, teachers, and law enforcement work hand in hand to create safer neighborhoods. Neighborhood watch programs are now common in many towns across the Andes. Parents organize group walks with their children to school. Schools have emergency plans and counselors trained to help students cope with trauma and fear. Through festivals, memorials, and storytelling, these communities honor the memories of those lost, not with despair, but with strength and solidarity. They share their histories openly, ensuring that future generations learn from the past. This unity is a powerful shield, one that hopes to prevent such darkness from ever returning. Though the shadow cast by Pedro Alonso López is long, the light of hope shines brighter. His story teaches us the importance of vigilance, but also the power of compassion, education, and community. Each effort to protect children, each law passed, each family supported, pushes back against the darkness. It reminds us that while evil exists, so does resilience. For those listening, whether in the Andes or anywhere else in the world, this story is a reminder: the safety of our children is a responsibility shared by all. It requires courage to face difficult truths, and commitment to create change. Pedro Alonso López's story will always be a warning, but it can also be a call to action. A call to protect, to heal, and to never forget. Even decades after the last confirmed events, law enforcement agencies across South America remain vigilant. Training programs for police now include case studies like Pedro Alonso López's, emphasizing the importance of early detection and community engagement. Efforts to improve communication between countries continue, with technology helping to bridge past gaps. Missing persons databases have expanded and become more accessible, allowing for quicker responses. Yet, vigilance isn't only the responsibility of officials. Communities are encouraged to trust their instincts, report suspicious behavior, and support each other. This collective awareness is the strongest defense against predators who may try to follow in López's footsteps. Amid all discussions about Pedro Alonso López, it's important to remember the real people behind the stories. Each victim was a child with dreams, hopes, and families who loved them. Many villages have created memorials and held annual remembrance events. These moments offer healing and ensure the victims are never forgotten. By honoring their memories, communities turn sorrow into strength. They affirm that every child's life matters, and that justice, in its truest sense, means preserving their stories and learning from them. Their voices continue, speaking softly but powerfully through time. One of the most powerful tools developed in response to cases like Pedro Alonso López's is education. Schools across South America have incorporated child safety programs that teach children how to recognize danger, how to say no, and how to seek help when needed. Parents and teachers receive training to spot early signs of abuse or suspicious behavior in their communities. Local governments have partnered with NGOs to provide resources and workshops aimed at empowering families. Education isn't just about preventing crime, it's about creating environments where children can grow safely, knowing they have adults who listen and protect. International cooperation has become a cornerstone in combating transnational crime. Pedro Alonso López's case exposed the weaknesses in cross-border communication that once allowed him to evade capture for years. Today, police forces from Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and neighboring countries participate in joint task forces and share intelligence regularly. New technologies like biometric databases and global alert systems improve the chances of finding missing persons and stopping criminals quickly. Collaboration is not without challenges, but it represents hope that through working together, tragedies like those caused by López can be prevented in the future. In recent years, governments and organizations across South America have launched awareness campaigns to educate the public about child safety and the warning signs of abuse. Posters, radio spots, and social media messages spread important information in both cities and remote villages. These campaigns emphasize the importance of reporting suspicious behavior, supporting victims, and creating safe spaces for children to speak openly. They aim to dismantle the silence and stigma that once allowed predators like Pedro Alonso López to operate undetected. Communities are encouraged to stand united, because protecting children is a shared responsibility. Despite the horrors of Pedro Alonso López's crimes, the communities affected have shown remarkable resilience. Families have found ways to rebuild trust and safety in their neighborhoods. Support groups, counseling services, and community centers provide spaces for healing and education. Stories of survival and strength inspire hope that even the darkest chapters can lead to brighter futures. The legacy of vigilance and care born from tragedy continues to grow, reminding us all that while evil may exist, human courage and compassion endure. Pedro Alonso López's case remains one of the most studied examples of extreme criminal behavior. Psychologists, criminologists, and law enforcement professionals analyze his actions to better understand the roots of such violence. While his crimes are horrifying, they also offer insight into how childhood trauma, neglect, and mental illness can shape dangerous paths. This understanding fuels modern